Hey man, you was in that motherfucker standing there while you were eating. When they bump down on you, they ask you, is you under these five or is you a rapper? You said a rapper. I got facts about these, man. Hey man, I'm on your ass, man. You know what I'm talking about?
Nobody expected this to happen, especially not like this. For years, Gucci Mane has been seen as the architect, the mentor, the man who helped shape an entire generation of Memphis street rap. Pooh Shiesty was supposed to be one of the crown jewels of that legacy. Signed, pushed, protected. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Because now, a few carefully chosen words, subtle moves, and silent signals have sparked a firestorm that fans can't ignore anymore. What looks like a simple moment of frustration is quickly turning into something much deeper. People are reading between the lines, replaying old interviews, dissecting lyrics, and connecting dots that were never meant to be connected out loud. And the more people look, the worse it starts to feel. This isn't just about business. This isn't just about loyalty. This is about power, control, and what really happens when the spotlight fades and the contracts stop protecting you. Pooh Shiesty didn't go on a loud rant. He didn't name names in a dramatic press conference. Instead, it was the silence, the timing, and the implications that shook everything. Fans noticed who wasn't mentioned, who stopped showing support, who suddenly felt distant. And in the rap world, silence often speaks louder than accusations, especially when prison time, money, and futures are involved. What's making this situation explode is the timing. Pooh Shiesty's legal situation already has him fighting an uphill battle, and now questions are being raised about who truly had his back when it mattered most. Was the image of brotherhood real? Or was it always conditional? Online, supporters are split. Some defending Gucci's position as a businessman, others saying this exposes a darker truth about how artists are treated once they're no longer useful. And the fallout? It's already spreading. Industry insiders are whispering. Fans are choosing sides. Old alliances are being re-examined. What once looked like a success story is now being reframed as a warning. Because if someone is closely tied to Gucci Mane as Pooh Shiesty can end up feeling abandoned or betrayed, then nobody is untouchable. This isn't just another rap beef. This is about legacy, responsibility, and what happens when the artist finally speaks, even without saying everything out loud. The relationship between Gucci Mane and Pooh Shiesty was once held up as a perfect example of how street credibility and industry power could align. Gucci wasn't just a label head in this story. He was presented as a guide, someone who had survived the system and was now pulling others out of it. When Pooh Shiesty signed, fans believed it was more than business. It felt like a stamp of protection, a promise that the mistakes of the past wouldn't repeat themselves. But behind the scenes, the dynamics were far more complicated than the public image suggested. As Pooh Shiesty's rise accelerated, so did the expectations placed on him. Success came fast, but so did pressure. The industry doesn't slow down for artists trying to balance fame, street ties, and legal trouble at the same time. Every move became magnified, every association scrutinized. While Gucci Mane publicly praised Shiesty's talent and momentum, insiders began noticing subtle shifts. Appearances together became less frequent. Public support felt more distant. What once looked like mentorship began to resemble a strictly transactional relationship. When Pooh Shiesty's legal problems escalated, many expected Gucci to step forward in a visible way, not necessarily to defend actions, but to stand beside his artist as a symbol of loyalty. That moment never really came. Instead, silence filled the gap. In the rap world, silence is rarely neutral. Fans immediately began asking questions. Was Gucci protecting the brand? Was he advised to step back? Or was this the moment where the reality of the music business became impossible to ignore? Pooh Shiesty never directly called Gucci Mane out, but his tone changed. In snippets, captions, and interviews, his words carried weight they hadn't before. There was frustration, disappointment, and a sense of isolation that didn't match the image of an artist backed by one of the most influential figures in hip-hop. Supporters read between the lines and felt like they were watching someone come to terms with a harsh truth: that loyalty in the industry often has an expiration date. What made the situation more uncomfortable was Gucci Mane's history. He's spoken openly about his own time locked up, about artists being abandoned when they can no longer generate revenue. That's why fans expected empathy. They expected action. When that didn't happen publicly, the narrative began to flip. Some started questioning whether Gucci had become the very thing he once criticized, a powerful figure prioritizing distance over responsibility when things get messy. At the same time, defenders of Gucci argued that the situation wasn't that simple. They pointed out that legal cases come with serious risks, and that involvement, even symbolic, can have consequences. From a business perspective, pulling back might have been the safest move. But hip-hop has never been judged solely by business logic. Culture values loyalty, especially when artists share a similar background and story. That clash between strategy and street code is where the tension truly lives. Meanwhile, Pooh Shiesty's supporters grew louder. They revisited old footage, early interviews, and moments when Gucci spoke about brotherhood and family within the label. The contrast between those words and the present silence became the heart of the controversy. It wasn't about contracts or clauses anymore. It was about expectations that were set publicly and then seemingly abandoned when reality tested them. This phase of the fallout also revealed how vulnerable artists become once their momentum is interrupted. Fame creates the illusion of security, but legal trouble exposes how quickly support structures can thin out. Pooh Shiesty's situation forced fans to confront an uncomfortable truth. Being signed doesn't guarantee protection, and mentorship doesn't always extend beyond profitability. For many young listeners, this wasn't just about one artist, it was a lesson unfolding in real time. As the narrative continued to build, one thing became clear. Whatever Pooh Shiesty was feeling, it wasn't temporary frustration. It was a shift in perspective. The optimism of a rising star was giving way to the realism of someone seeing the industry from the inside. And whether Gucci Mane intended it or not, that realization was now shaping the public conversation in a way that couldn't be undone. This was no longer just a story about legal trouble or label politics. It was about trust, power, and the moment an artist realizes that the people he thought would stand with him might only stand as long as the spotlight stays on. As time passed, the silence surrounding the situation began to feel heavier than any statement ever could. Fans weren't just reacting to what was being said. They were reacting to what wasn't. Every post, every interview, every public appearance was examined for meaning. When Gucci Mane spoke about music, business, or legacy without mentioning Pooh Shiesty, people noticed. In a culture built on recognition and respect, omission became its own form of messaging. Pooh Shiesty's mindset appeared to shift as well. The confidence of an artist moving upward was replaced by the guarded tone of someone navigating disappointment. His words started carrying subtext, not angry, not reckless, but reflective. It sounded like someone who had expected support during the hardest moment of his life and was instead forced to sit with the realization that survival in the industry often comes down to self-reliance. This wasn't the first time hip-hop had seen this pattern. History is filled with stories of artists who flourished under powerful mentors, only to feel abandoned once trouble hit. That's why this situation resonated so strongly. It felt familiar, almost predictable, and that familiarity made it more painful. People weren't just watching a conflict unfold, they were watching a cycle repeat itself yet again. As discussion spread, fans began drawing comparisons between Gucci Mane's past and his present position of power. Many remembered how vocal Gucci once was about being mistreated by the system, about labels turning their backs, about learning who was really there when everything fell apart. That memory created expectations. People believed he would be different. When his actions appeared to mirror the same distancing he once criticized, disappointment replaced admiration for some supporters. Defenders continued to argue that the public didn't know the full story. They pointed out that private support doesn't always look loud, and that not everything needs to be broadcast online. But that argument struggled to hold weight in a culture where public gestures are often how loyalty is measured. The absence of visible solidarity left room for speculation, and speculation quickly turned into narrative. Behind the scenes, whispers grew about internal strain. Even without direct confirmation, the sense of a fractured relationship became hard to ignore. Artists around the situation seemed more cautious. Collaborations slowed. The energy surrounding the label shifted. What once felt like a tight-knit movement began to look fragmented, as if everyone was waiting to see how the situation would resolve before choosing their position. Pooh Shiesty's supporters also began reframing his story. Instead of seeing him only as an artist facing legal trouble, they started viewing him as a symbol of how quickly momentum can disappear when power dynamics change. His experience became a cautionary tale about overestimating protection and underestimating isolation. That narrative struck a chord, especially with younger artists and fans who dream of success without fully understanding the cost. The emotional core of the fallout centered on expectation versus reality. Mentorship creates hope. It suggests guidance, safety, and shared responsibility. When that structure feels absent in moments of crisis, the disappointment cuts deeper than any contract dispute. Pooh Shiesty's implied frustration wasn't about fame or money. It was about feeling left alone at the worst possible time. Meanwhile, Gucci Mane's silence continued to shape the narrative, whether intentionally or not. Silence can be strategic, but it can also be interpreted as avoidance. In this case, it allowed others to fill in the gaps. Each day without clarification strengthened the belief that something had gone wrong behind closed doors. The longer it lasted, the harder it became to reverse public perception. By this point, the fallout had moved beyond two individuals. It was influencing conversations about the music industry as a whole. Fans questioned whether labels truly care about artists beyond profitability. Artists questioned whether loyalty exists once risk enters the picture. The story became less about blame and more about systemic behavior that repeats itself regardless of who's involved. As Part 2 closes, the tension remains unresolved. No public reconciliation, no direct confrontation, just a growing divide shaped by silence, disappointment, and shifting expectations. Whatever the truth behind the scenes, the public narrative has already begun to solidify, and once that happens, controlling the story becomes nearly impossible. The question now isn't whether this situation will have consequences. It's how deep those consequences will run, and whether the damage done to trust, legacy, and belief in mentorship can ever truly be repaired. By the time the third wave of reactions hit, it was clear that this controversy wasn't just a temporary scandal. It was beginning to reshape how fans, peers, and even industry insiders viewed both Pooh Shiesty and Gucci Mane. Social media commentary had evolved from immediate outrage into deeper analysis, with fans questioning the power dynamics at play. Observers weren't just asking what was said or done. They were asking what this meant for loyalty, mentorship, and the authenticity of relationships in the music business. For an artist like Pooh Shiesty, whose rise was closely tied to Gucci Mane's influence, this was more than a personal conflict. It was a public examination of legacy and trust. While public posts and indirect comments kept the tension alive, industry insiders reportedly began reassessing partnerships and collaborations. Record labels, management teams, and even streaming platforms are keenly aware of how narrative shapes consumer behavior. When a prominent figure appears to distance themselves from an artist during a critical moment, it sends signals that ripple across the industry. Quiet whispers began about whether Shiesty's career trajectory would be permanently affected, or whether this was simply a momentary blip in an otherwise promising journey. Either way, the perception of instability became a central theme. At the same time, fans dissected every previous interaction between Gucci Mane and Pooh Shiesty, looking for signs that the bond might have been strained before this point. Early mentorship moments, public praise, and collaborative performances were revisited. Comments once seen as supportive began to feel conditional, interpreted through a lens shaped by disappointment and suspicion. The realization that relationships in the music industry might not be as solid as they appear struck many as a painful lesson, and one that extended beyond a single artist. Pooh Shiesty himself appeared more guarded in his tone. In interviews and social media interactions, there was a subtle shift from exuberant confidence to careful reflection. While nothing was directly stated about Gucci Mane, the undertones were clear. The frustration wasn't about fame, money, or even legal troubles. It was about the absence of the very support that had been promised. Fans began to empathize, seeing him not just as a rising artist, but as someone confronting the harsh realities of mentorship in an industry that often values utility over loyalty. Gucci Mane's silence continued to shape public perception, and in some ways, it magnified the effect of Shiesty's implied statements. Where once public figures could control the narrative through direct engagement, the void left by non-response allowed the audience to fill in the blanks. In this case, speculation and interpretation became the story itself. Each day without clarification was another day for doubt, resentment, and judgment to accumulate. Some argued that a single statement could have mitigated the fallout, but the lack of one only reinforced suspicions. The controversy also illuminated a larger cultural conversation about what mentorship really means in hip-hop. Fans and commentators debated the distinction between business guidance and genuine support. Is mentorship only about helping an artist succeed in charts and sales? Or does it carry a responsibility to stand by them when mistakes are made, or when external pressures, including legal battles, threaten their future? This debate became central to the conversation, as people questioned whether loyalty in the industry is transactional or relational. Meanwhile, the online narrative became increasingly polarized. Some defended Gucci Mane, arguing that every decision he made was calculated for long-term stability, for both himself and the label. Others argued that no amount of business strategy could excuse the apparent absence of personal support when an artist is in crisis. The debate spilled over into multiple platforms, drawing in not just fans but analysts, commentators, and even other artists who weighed in on how mentorship and loyalty intersect in a high-stakes environment. Within this environment, Pooh Shiesty's experience became symbolic. It wasn't just about one artist or one mentor. It became a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust, the limits of loyalty, and the often invisible cost of success. Fans who had once celebrated Shiesty's rapid rise now watched closely, aware that the lessons being learned in real time could apply to anyone navigating fame, power, and public perception. By the end of this phase, the consequences were no longer abstract. Relationships had shifted, reputations were being re-evaluated, and the industry's perception of both figures had been subtly altered. What started as an apparent expression of frustration had morphed into a complex narrative about trust, influence, and accountability in a world where public and private lines blur constantly. It was no longer just a story about conflict. It had become a moment that could define the future of careers, friendships, and legacies. Even those who remained neutral acknowledged the weight of the situation. The unfolding events highlighted how quickly perception can change, how silence can speak volumes, and how an artist's most private frustrations can become public judgments. This wasn't merely about social media or viral moments anymore. It was about the structural realities of mentorship, fame, and expectation. And for both Pooh Shiesty and Gucci Mane, the ripple effects were only beginning. As the controversy deepened, the ripples extended beyond just the two artists involved. The industry itself began to take notice, with collaborators, producers, and fellow artists watching the fallout closely. In an environment where perception can dictate opportunity, whispers of strain and tension can alter career trajectories almost as much as legal or financial setbacks. What was once considered a secure relationship under the Gucci Mane umbrella suddenly felt fragile, and people began to question just how much of that mentorship was genuine and how much was driven by image and convenience. The timing of the exposure couldn't have been more critical. Pooh Shiesty was navigating legal battles that demanded focus, resilience, and stability, and yet the spotlight was now split between personal challenges and public speculation about his support system. Fans and observers noted that the pressure he faced wasn't only from outside forces, it was also internal, coming from expectations that had been built around a perceived loyalty that now felt absent. That gap between expectation and reality fueled a narrative of betrayal, one that was hard to ignore because it was rooted in the audience's understanding of how mentorship was supposed to work. The public discussion quickly escalated from social media debates into serious conversations about career security and survival in the music industry. for young artists and fans alike. This was a visible case study of the consequences when guidance and protection are conditional rather than absolute. Mentorship, which had once appeared as a guarantee of safety and advancement, was now being questioned as a strategy that prioritizes optics over genuine support. That realization shifted the tone of engagement from casual gossip to ethical evaluation, with people debating whether labels and mentors have a moral responsibility to stand by artists during the most vulnerable moments of their careers. Meanwhile, Pooh Shiesty's demeanor in public appearances and social media posts reflected the weight of these revelations. While he maintained professionalism and avoided direct confrontation, the underlying frustration and disappointment were palpable to those who paid close attention. It was the subtlety in tone, the choice of words, the timing of posts, all of which communicated a story that wasn't spelled out but was unmistakably understood. Fans became interpreters, reading between lines, connecting the dots, and forming opinions based on nuance rather than outright statements. The art of implication became as powerful as direct accusation. Gucci Mane's ongoing silence further complicated matters. In the world of hip-hop, absence can speak volumes, and his lack of direct engagement allowed speculation to fill every void. Supporters argued that this might have been a calculated move, maintaining distance to protect legal and financial interests. Critics, however, interpreted it as neglect, a failure to live up to the standards of loyalty that he himself had once advocated for. This divergence in interpretation only deepened the divide in public perception, turning what might have been a private issue into a widely debated cultural moment. The situation also drew attention to the fragility of alliances in the music industry. Collaborators who once appeared aligned with both Gucci Mane and Pooh Shiesty began to reassess their positions. Relationships that had seemed stable suddenly carried new risks, and everyone involved had to navigate the optics of association carefully. The fallout wasn't just about personal feelings. It was about professional strategy, risk management, and maintaining credibility in an industry where trust is currency. As the narrative continued, fans began to reflect on broader patterns in hip-hop. This wasn't an isolated incident. Mentorship and loyalty have always been complex, sometimes conditional, and occasionally performative. But witnessing the consequences play out in real time offered a stark reminder of how quickly admiration and trust can transform into skepticism and disappointment. It was a cautionary tale not just for artists but for the fans who idolize them, a lesson in how success, visibility, and dependency intersect. The ripple effects reached social media, music streams, and industry chatter, creating a network of pressure that neither Pooh Shiesty nor Gucci Mane could fully control. Every statement, post, or absence became part of the ongoing story. The line between personal grievance and public narrative blurred, reinforcing the notion that fame magnifies every choice, every action, and every silence. What might have remained private in another era became unavoidable, public, and permanent. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the fallout had entered a critical stage. The discussion had evolved from immediate shock to systemic reflection. People were no longer just debating who said what. They were analyzing structures of power, responsibility, and loyalty within the hip-hop industry itself. The consequences of this exposure were no longer hypothetical. They were actively shaping reputations, career decisions, and public perception. And while the final outcomes were still unknown, one thing was undeniable. The moment had left an indelible mark, not just on those directly involved, but on the entire ecosystem surrounding them. As the dust began to settle, the ripple effects of the controversy became more apparent. The exposure had altered how both Pooh Shiesty and Gucci Mane were perceived, not just by fans but by peers, collaborators, and the industry at large. For Pooh Shiesty, the experience became a defining chapter, one that combined personal growth with public scrutiny. He was no longer just a rising star. He had become a symbol of what happens when expectations of loyalty meet the harsh realities of business and reputation. Each new discussion, each retrospective analysis, added layers to the story, making it clear that this was about more than individual actions. It was about the system itself. The immediate aftermath saw alliances shift. Artists, producers, and even promoters started recalibrating their approach to both Shiesty and Gucci Mane. Some expressed solidarity quietly, offering support in subtle ways, while others stepped back, wary of associating too closely with a narrative that had become unpredictable. In a business driven by perception, every move matters. One wrong association could affect future opportunities, collaborations, and fan reception. The stakes had grown beyond personal disappointment. The fallout was now embedded in professional survival. For Gucci Mane, the silence that had once fueled speculation now demanded reflection. Though critics argued he had prioritized distance over loyalty, there was also acknowledgement that managing an empire requires difficult decisions, especially when legal or reputational risk is involved. Still, the perception of inaction weighed heavily. In a culture that prizes loyalty as much as talent, even carefully calculated restraint can be interpreted as negligence. The legacy he had built as a mentor, once unassailable, now required careful navigation to maintain credibility in the eyes of the public. Meanwhile, Pooh Shiesty's response was measured yet poignant. He avoided public confrontations and incendiary comments, instead allowing his actions and subtle statements to convey his position. The shift in tone reflected maturity, an understanding that the public's gaze is unrelenting and that impulsive reactions could exacerbate damage. Observers noted that his focus appeared to be on rebuilding and maintaining momentum within his own career, leveraging lessons from the fallout to approach future collaborations and public engagements with greater strategy and awareness. The broader conversation extended beyond individual reputations. Fans, analysts, and cultural commentators began dissecting the structural patterns that contributed to the controversy. What does loyalty truly mean in the music industry? How much responsibility do mentors have to protect their artists during crises? And how much of the mentorship model is designed to benefit visibility rather than provide genuine support? These questions resonated deeply, as the story had evolved from a feud into a cautionary tale about trust, power, and the cost of fame. The situation also sparked reflection on the responsibility of audiences. Social media amplified every nuance, every omission, and every perceived slight. Public interpretation became as influential as the reality behind the scenes. Fans recognized that viral moments often distort truth and that attention can magnify pain in ways that prolong consequences. The narrative surrounding Pooh Shiesty and Gucci Mane was not just written by the individuals involved, it was co-authored by millions of spectators whose interpretations carried real-world weight. Financial and professional implications were equally significant. Streaming numbers, potential deals, and endorsements were influenced by public sentiment. For both artists, reputational shifts meant recalibrating strategies, choosing projects carefully, and being mindful of public perception. While success had once seemed guaranteed for Shiesty, the exposure served as a reminder that industry momentum is fragile and requires consistent navigation of relationships, both personal and professional. Yet despite the turbulence, the story also revealed resilience. Pooh Shiesty demonstrated that even in moments of perceived abandonment, focus, discipline, and careful navigation can mitigate long-term damage. Gucci Mane, for his part, retained his influence and continued to shape the industry, but the episode underscored the importance of aligning public perception with private action. The lessons learned would ripple through both careers, serving as reminders that influence carries responsibility, and power without empathy can create lasting consequences. Ultimately, the controversy became less about blame and more about growth. It highlighted how fame, loyalty, and expectation collide in unpredictable ways. For fans, it was a glimpse into the realities of mentorship and power in hip-hop. For the artists themselves, it was an inflection point, a moment of reckoning that would inform every decision moving forward. While the fallout was serious, it was also instructive, shaping narratives, relationships, and legacies in ways that extended far beyond the headlines. By the end, one truth remained undeniable. The moment would be remembered not just for the exposure itself, but for the lessons embedded within it. In a culture that celebrates loyalty and mentorship, the consequences of breaking unspoken expectations are profound. The story of Pooh Shiesty and Gucci Mane would live on as both cautionary tale and testament to the complexity of relationships, power, and survival in the music industry. It was a moment that could not be ignored, rewritten, or erased, and its impact would resonate for years to come. If you followed this story from start to finish, you've seen how quickly loyalty, trust, and mentorship can be tested in the music industry. Pooh Shiesty's experience isn't just about one feud. It's a wake-up call for artists, fans, and everyone watching how power and relationships intersect in hip-hop. When the people you expect to have your back stay silent, the consequences aren't just emotional. They can reshape careers and legacies forever. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Gucci Mane handled this correctly? Or should loyalty have come first? And what lessons do you think up-and-coming artists should take from this story? If you want more in-depth breakdowns, behind-the-scenes insights, and real analysis of the hottest stories in music, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next big reveal could change everything.